page 989, and we're going to be reading Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 to 32. Matthew chapter 21, beginning at verse 23. Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "And who gave you this authority?" Jesus replied, "I'll ask you one question. I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he'll ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, we're afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." Then he said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? There was a man who had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work today in the vineyard.' 'I will not,' he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, 'I will, sir.' But he did not go. Which of the 2 did what his father wanted?" "The first," they answered. Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him." This is the word of the Lord.
Okay, good morning. I want to start with a question. Who has the right to tell you what to do? Who do you have no choice but to listen to? Any ideas? Perhaps raise your hand if you went back to school this week. Is there anyone there that you should be listening to? No, fair enough. You go back to school next week. Ah, I see. Okay, that's why. Okay. And did anyone go back to work this week? Yeah, and there are people there, or at least one person for me, who I have no choice but to listen to. But I do have a list of people who I think it's a very, very good idea to do what they say 99% of the time. Parents, maybe, yeah. It's usually a pretty good idea. Teachers, our bosses at work, things the government tell us to do, not to drive too fast, the police, and there are other people who it's a very, very good idea to listen to. I know I'll get support for this one. Dentists, yep, they're good to listen to. Doctors, but some people we have absolutely no choice but to obey. And the passage from the Bible that we read just now, we have a scene like this. Jesus is surrounded by a crowd of people, and he's teaching in the temple courts. So he's there teaching the people, and through the crowd come the religious leaders who thought they were very, very important. I suspect the crowd were quite afraid of them, and as they came through the crowd, the crowd would have got a bit nervous and would have let them burst through to the front They'd have just stepped aside, let them walk through. And the religious leaders came along and they said to Jesus, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" In other words, who do you think you are? And what right do you have to tell us what to do? You're acting like you own the place. Now, Jesus, in the past few days leading up to that story, he'd been doing some pretty outrageous things. Does anyone remember any of the things that he'd been up to? He actually came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Yes, he came into Jerusalem riding in a donkey, and the people shouted, basically, "Hurrah, there's the king." And he didn't say, "I'm not the king." He said, "Yep, that's right, I'm the king." He didn't mind being called the king at all. And then he went into the temple, and they were in the temple, instead of worshiping God, they were actually selling stuff, and they had all their stalls set up, some big car boot sale. Jesus went in the temple, and they were selling animals so that the animals could be sacrificed. And do you know what Jesus did? He went into that temple, and he did act as if he owned the place. He went in and he tipped all the tables upside down, and he let the animals out, and he actually caused mass panic in the temple as he went round shouting and ordering them to get out of the temple, because it's a place where they were supposed to be worshipping instead. So when they asked Jesus this question, what right do you have to do what you're doing? He responded with a question for this. Now, I often do that at work, actually. Someone will ask me, "Tim, what do you think we should do about this problem?" And I respond with a question along the lines of, do you think the time is right for me to make that decision? Or, out of interest, if you were me, what would you do? Now, the reason I do that is because I don't actually know the answer. And politicians do that a lot as well. Politicians do that an awful lot. They get asked a question. "Minister, do you accept that the shamble of the past few days calls into question the Prime Minister's judgment?" What the past few days show, and I think your listeners will understand, is that we have a Prime Minister unafraid to make decisions, working round the clock for the good of the British people. But, Minister, do you think those decisions have been good ones? I think that if you ask your listeners, they would tell you that the Prime Minister is faced with difficult decisions day in, day out, and he doesn't duck them. Jesus's question back to them, it wasn't like that. It wasn't just to try to avoid answering the question. It was actually a question that gets to the heart of everything. And I'm going to try to explain it, because he said, John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? Now, you're thinking, what is all that about? Why was that such a great question? Harry said earlier, it was great that on these holidays, we had people who could really explain things, and now you're coming up with this obscure stuff about John's baptism. So we need to go on a detour into the Old Testament, and I promise I'll be able to explain this. Now, the Bible is divided into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we're going to go back into the Old Testament. And the Old Testament, God is constantly promising that one day a king will come. And that king will be called the Messiah. He's God's rescuer king, sent to come and rescue us. And in the Old Testament, there's a prophet, and his name is Malachi. And he promised that before God's special king came, Elijah would come. He said someone like the prophet Elijah would come. He would come before God's special king. And then at the very, very beginning of the New Testament, a man comes along called John the Baptist. And I want you to remember 3 things about him. And there's a prize if you can remember those 3 things at the end of the service. They all begin with the letter H to make it easy. And I want you to remember 3 things about him, and I'll explain why he was important. The first thing about him, he was hairy. Okay? He was hairy. That's not hard to remember. Elijah, the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings, is described like this. He had a garment of hair and he had a leather belt around his waist. That's way back. That's hundreds of years before Jesus. And then John the Baptist comes in the New Testament and he's described like this in Matthew. John's clothes were made of camel's hair and he had a leather belt around his waist. John dressed just like Elijah. So if you knew your Old Testament, you should have been on high alert for God's king. You should have been on Messiah watch. So he was hairy. So I'm going to try and help you remember this. What were John's clothes made out of? Was anyone listening? Camel? What color are camels? Yellow, kind of a yellow, yeah. A camel. Camels are camel, aren't they? Yeah. Well, that gives you a clue that this is probably not camel's hair. Probably not. Who knows? Maybe it was made with wolves that came into our garden. But he wore a coat of camel's hair. And then he had, where's it gone? Where's my leather belt? He got a leather belt round him. And he was going around as a prophet preaching. And what everyone was supposed to think was, this is Elijah. So he was hairy, or he looked hairy, because of his camel's hair coat. Now, the second H I want you to think about is he was hungry. He was hungry. He must have been hungry because of what he ate. So, I'm going to give you, actually, it's more than a clue. This is what he ate. There you go. He ate locusts and wild honey. Locusts are insects. So, here we go. Did you know that Amazon does locusts? I'd like to try some roasted locusts. They're whole, they're natural. I will read out the these whole roasted, well, they're actually crickets, which are from the locust family. You're going to have to trust me. It says in my book, which is the definitive word on locusts, that they are actually, crickets are locusts. They're the ones we have in the UK. They can be enjoyed as a snack, or they can be used in cooking. They have a mild, slightly toasted and deliciously nutty flavour. They're high in sustainable protein and contain all 9 essential amino acids in a highly digestible form. They also contain 100% of all the vitamin B12 that you need in a day. Would anyone like to try some locusts? I'm not sure. I've not actually tried these. I hope you're very, very welcome to try a locust. Now, you can genuinely have one. They are. What are your thoughts? You've had them before. Do you like them? Salt and vinegar. They probably. Okay. Wow. But that's very contagious for me. So I really ought to summon up the bravery, didn't I? Now, well done for that. You definitely deserve a clap this time, for sure. And he also had honey. So I've got my honey, and I think if I squeeze some in there, it's not coming out very well. It's running honey, but like all running honey, after about a week of being opened, it turns rock solid. So you had locusts and wild honey. And I think probably if you put locusts and wild honey together, you get something that tastes more like this. I think so. I think you deserve one of those. Everyone else has to remember the 3 H's. Okay, everyone else has to remember the 3 H's. So it's Harry, he was hungry. Now, I shouldn't just tell you about locusts and honey. You see, the really important thing to remember about his diet was that even his diet was trying to tell us something about God. And this is the serious point. He was trying to tell us something about God, because whenever there were locusts in the Bible, it was always a sign that God was angry, because a plague of locusts was a terrible, terrible thing. In this book, actually, it talks about the awful plagues of locusts that have happened. When a plague of locusts comes, you could have a trillion locusts at once, and they could eat all the crops, and then the people would starve. So whenever there are stories of locusts in the Bible, it's a warning. God is angry. He's angry because we don't love him, we turn our backs on him, we don't worship him like we should. But then whenever there's honey in the Bible, it's actually all about how God is kind and he loves us and he gives us good things, which of course is what God is like. So that was John the Baptist's message. God is angry. Yes, he is angry because we've ignored him. But, it's a big but, he wants to be kind. And he's sending us his rescuer king. And that's the locusts and the honey. The third H, hairy, hungry, he was also humble. He was humble because he told everyone, I'm not the rescuer king. He kept telling everyone that. That was his main message. I'm not the rescuer king. He even said, I'm not even good enough to tie Jesus' shoelaces. And one day he pointed to Jesus and he said, him over there, he's the one. He's the special one. He's the Messiah. Now, we had a holiday the other week. We went to Suffolk, which is over in the east of England. It's where I grew up, near where I grew up in Essex, and I saw my family. And one of the things that we experienced, which we don't have very much around here, is because over there it's arable, which means they have lots of wheat crops and things like that. And we frequently, as we were driving along, we came across this like a van with an orange light flashing, and the van would be driving quite slowly and towards the middle of the road. Why do you think it was doing that? So it's kind of a truck, not a big truck, but like a van, like a Land Rover, and an orange light is flashing. Anyone think why they were doing that? They're driving in the middle of the road, and I then had to slow down. Stopping the traffic because for a wide load. Yeah, and over there, it's because combine harvesters were coming through. A massive farm machinery was coming. So there was this sort of small truck that went in ahead saying, look out, there's something big coming. And that was John's job. He wasn't to promote himself. He was to say, it's him. He's the special one. Jesus is coming. So let's go all the way back. When Jesus asked these important people his question was, what do you think about John the Baptist? He was really saying, if you know who John is, you would know who I am, because he's the one who's sent to say that the special one is coming. And Jesus was the special one. If you would believe what John's message was, you would believe me. And then the important people, what they did, if you read the story in the Bible, they discussed it among themselves. They kind of went off. What do you think we should say? If we say that his message come from God, then he's going to turn around and say, why don't you believe him? If we say, well, I don't think John's got anything important to say, then all these people out there, they all think John's amazing. Oh, what are we going to do? So they went back to Jesus and they said, Jesus, we just don't know. We just don't know what to think. Then Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing those things. For the religious leaders, for the important people of Jesus' day, don't know was the least embarrassing answer. Who thinks they really didn't know? Who thinks they really didn't know who Jesus was? Who thinks that they did know who Jesus was, but they just didn't want it to be true? Yeah. Anna thinks the second one, so you know, which means that'll be the right answer. Which it is. And then Jesus says a very simple story, and one we would recognize. There's two sons. We'll call them Horrid Henry and Perfect Peter. Son number one. So he said to him, go and work in the vineyard, son. Just like, go and tidy your room. And the first son, Horrid Henry, says, no, I won't. But then he went and worked. Son number two, go and tidy your room. Yes, I will. Of course I will, Dad. But then he didn't. I wonder which one you're most like. So the chief priests and elders were asked, the important people were asked, which of the two sons did what his father wanted? Son number one or son number two? So son number one said, I'm not going to do it. And then he did it anyway, went and tidied his room. Or son number two said, no way. Son number two said, yes, I will. And then he went and did it. And so Jesus asked, which of the two did the right thing? And the chief priests and elders probably looked at the floor and said, it was the first one. The first one did. And Jesus said, that's what's happening right now. The religious people, the perfect Peters who appear to love God, are actually not listening to him. Whereas the Horrid Henrys, who have never shown any interest in God before, are now listening to him and doing what he wants. And this is good news and bad news, just like locusts and honey are good news and bad news. It's bad news because it's possible for us to be in church, to try to be good, and miss the most important thing. And the most important thing is that we need to recognize who Jesus is, and we need to ask him to be our rescuer king. The good news of all of that is that no matter what we have done, even if we've said no, 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 many, many times to Jesus, however bad we've been, God wants to forgive us and rescue us. So John T, he promised an accessible talk, if you saw the email, and I've done my best, but I hope the attempt at being accessible has not caused the sting of this passage to be lost. Because for all of us, whether we're 5 or 95, we need to answer this question of who is Jesus? How do we respond to the authority of his claims? His claims to be God, his claims to be able to tell us how to live. Do we stare at the floor and mumble, I don't know? Do we say, well, I prefer to think that God is like this and Jesus doesn't quite match up? Or do we say, what right does he tell me how to live? Or actually, do we see this as unbelievably good news? All those past no's when we've said no to Jesus, they can be overridden, they can be forgiven, and the slate wiped clean. A past of refusing to obey can be forgiven. And that is very, very true if we've never accepted the Christian message, if we've never believed in Jesus before. But wonderfully, it's also true if we're long in the tooth as a Christian and we've lost our way a little bit. And the past 2 Sundays, Margaret has preached from the book of Haggai. And if you missed them, I really do recommend watching the recordings on the website. There were many, many striking things that she brought out from Haggai. But for me, one of the most encouraging was the fact that it took just 3 weeks for the people to hear the message and be transformed. And for me, a prayer for us all is, may God help us to respond like the people of Haggai's day. When Jesus says, go and work today in the vineyard, may we do so. So if you're young and think you might qualify for one of these, you've got 3 H's to remember. I'm going to do them one last time. And you can have a second one. It's the 3 H's are, he was hairy, he was humble, and he was hungry. Yeah. So if you come and see me at the end, I think you've remembered those. If you think you qualify for one of these, then please do. And if you'd like to try